Welcome to the Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. Today, my guest is a higher education professional who has worked in the sector for over 10 years and has seen a lot of change and innovation. She has a keen interest in supporting hard-to-reach demographics and focuses on wider societal issues which affect engagement in higher education. She believes that while her main domain is work experience, academic achievement is still the principle that young people should aim for. So I'm delighted to say that today I'm talking with Charlotte Marshall. Hi, Charlotte.
Hi, Alastair. Thank you so much for having me today.
Well, it's great to talk to you, and I really appreciate the time that you're taking because I know your time is precious. And universities is such a fascinating topic, especially for people in the workplace, because they're looking at how are young people being for the workplace. And there's a lot of discussion about that, which we will come to in due course. And we'll also talk about what it's like to be a student today as well. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit more about you. You are right in the middle of being a millennial. First of all, do you think you are a typical millennial?
Yes, Alastair, you're right. I am peak millennial at 37 years old. I'm sort of right in the middle of that. And I think it's a really difficult question to answer because it's actually quite difficult to define what a millennial is, whether that's certain characteristics, certain, being born within a certain time frame, certain values, certain tastes in culture. But yes, I think in many ways I am. I feel like as a millennial these days, you're sort of sandwiched between two very different generations. And you mentioned earlier, before we started this, about how there's, how millennials might have felt some tension about being labelled such a way earlier on. And I think now, because we're in that generation of, social media, people sort of picking up on trends and, sort of being able to label things easier, I think certainly a lot of millennials have become more comfortable with that. And it's almost like it's the Gen Z now who are the next generation, which are getting flack in inverted commas. So, yeah, I do think I'm typical in that I've lived through sort of the internet and obviously with AI now and a lot of like global instability, and that no doubt will shape sort of how you see this world. There's a lot of upsides to being born later. There's a lot of downsides as well. There's obviously, we could do a whole other podcast on what that is. But yeah, I think I'm typical and I'm proud.
So, let's talk about some of the traits, because actually it was really interesting. You said about being proud to be a millennial, and I do remember when millennials started coming into the workforce back in the sort of 2010s, that there was a bit of pushback that millennials didn't like to be called millennials because it was almost being weaponized against them, as opposed to Gen Z, who are coming into the workforce right now, who actually embrace the title of Gen Z. So it's quite an interesting distinction that took place there. But in terms of being a millennial, very typically, the sort of things we're looking at is collaboration. I think is probably the single biggest term that's attributed towards millennials, that they really like to collaborate. They like the team spirit, the team ethos of things. And they also, in my survey that I did last 2 years ago now, we found that actually millennials consider themselves to be the best at reading body language and being intuitive to other people. So what do you think of that?
I love that. I certainly think I'm really glad to hear that. I think it's having that sort of experience with lots of different generations. For a lot of Gen Z, due to COVID, they weren't able to have part-time jobs to the extent maybe that I was and people of my generation. So at 16 years old, I was mixing with boomers, people who were a little bit older than me, Gen X. And I think you do get a good sort of feel as to sort of how people respond in lots of different situations. At the time, being in part-time jobs, which I didn't necessarily enjoy, I wouldn't necessarily have thought, I'm learning so much about society here, this is great. I was just thinking, when am I leaving? When am I going home? But looking back, certainly, yeah, I think you do get I did have a really wide ranging experience, with nightlife as well. Nightlife was completely different then to what it is now. So, mixing in workplace environments and then in social and cultural environments as well with lots of different people probably did give us a really good sense of that sort of human experience. And obviously, gorging on social media as well.
And it's interesting you talk about, the COVID effect. And it was one of the things I was determined to do in my book was to identify how COVID impacted each generation, because it did impact each generation. For you, even though you were already established in the workplace, you then had to start working online. You had to start working in a different way. Your relationships with your peers was different. And for many millennials, of course, they were just entering into more management positions at that stage. So were they dealing with people from different generations? And again, you mentioned about being the sandwich generation, which, yes, you have become that generation where many millennials are now in management positions, all the way from junior right through to C-suite positions. But you have people who are reporting to you who are both older and younger than you, and that creates a unique dynamic. Is that what you find in the university sector?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We have a wide range of ages and ethnicities working with us, which is wonderful. But yeah, certain generations do respond differently. I find in general, sort of Boomer and Gen X generation sort of are more in tune with hierarchies and will be like, that's the way it's done. The manager will tell you, wait for the process. With Gen Z, it's not really like that. And I personally really like that because I don't think it's necessarily very time effective to just go through structures all the time. I think it's quite nice to think creatively and try to work collaboratively and find new ways of working. But yeah, certainly it's different. But also at the same time, with some Gen Z, because I also work in hospitality as well part time. So I work with a lot of Gen Z in the restaurant, in bars. If they don't want to do something, they just won't do it. And they won't say anything. And that's fine. I support a lot of young people as well who obviously in my role as placements coordinator at our spa who will have workplace disputes and things going on. And, sometimes it's like, okay, there's no need for that. But sometimes I'm like, good for you. Like, things like that happened to me when I was younger, and I'm sure generations of people before me, and we didn't say anything. And actually, sometimes it is good to say something and to speak up. So, like with everything, it's a double-edged sword. But yeah, certainly there's different approaches for dealing with different generations. But also, I think it's important to find ways to speak to everyone, and that sort of should be the main goal, really, find ways and, activities which will appeal to everyone. And that's not easy, but it can happen.
And let's talk about your work at Bath Spa University. And it was an event that we met and we thought it would be really good to chat. In fact, it was one of your colleagues, and it was a really interesting opportunity to talk about education. And the first thing I'd like to ask you really about Bath Spa is, as you say, you're working there at the university, you've been there for a while. You will have seen a big difference, I'm sure, in the way that you experienced university or how people of your generation experienced university to those who are experiencing it now. So, for the benefit of those people who haven't maybe been to university for quite some time, what are the key differences and what is it like now being a student?
Yeah, there is a lot of differences from when I was at university. It's certainly more like a package now. And that's obviously because of fees. If you're paying, because the fees for 9,000-ish, can't remember the exact term, sorry, came in at 2010. And I was still at university then. I wasn't affected by those fees, but I felt really like that was a lot, that was tough. And obviously now when you're paying so much, I definitely think university has to step up a bit. There is education, but we have a huge wellbeing service. Lots of other universities do as well. We have huge career service, which I'm part of. We're a huge team relative to the size of our university. So there's certainly, it's not just going in, doing your lectures and then going off and doing your own thing. You know, we have 24-hour helplines that people can call when they need wellbeing support. We do all sorts. We have pastoral support. You know, we have people that can support, you know, who work with charities that will support you into the workplace. Or we offer career support up to 15 months after graduation. You know, it's got to provide more. You know, it's got to give more, you know, not just because of the fees, but because of the life-changing effect the university can have as well. I think pretty much, you know, not as many students will move too far away anymore. You know, a lot of our students, for example, will come from within a 50-mile radius, and I think that's not unusual. But I think that means that universities sort of have more responsibility. You know, when I was at university, I just went in for my lectures, went in for my seminars, and that was it. I was involved in a couple of societies, but I wasn't seeking career support or wellbeing support. I'm sure it was there in some capacity, but you know, we go into a lot of lectures. We remind people what support's available in terms of, you know, it's not just CVs and cover letters. It's starting your own business. It's sort of you know, managing finances, becoming freelance, you know, all these different pathways which people could potentially take. Bar is primarily a creative university. We have a lot of creative courses. We do have humanities and sciences as well, but certainly the ethos of Bar is to be creative in everything you do. You know, you can be a scientist and you can start your own business. You can be a teacher and have a side hustle. And that's very indicative of the modern world. You know, I think it'd be very hard to find someone who's just done one thing their whole life and never branched out, you know, for any generation. You know, we are all sort of complex individuals who have lots to offer and lots to do, and Bar is definitely very supportive of that.
And do you think Bath Spa's typical of other universities, or do you think you're a bit of an outlier in the level of support? Because you talked about the outreach that you do and so on. So is that indicative of the type of students you have, or do you think this is fairly typical of other student life that people would experience?
Well, obviously, Alastair, our support is the best. But no, I think you're right. Yes. It's not necessarily the case of all universities. You know, with Russell Group, you know, that it's going to be different. But I think, you know, looking at, you know, speaking to other colleagues in the sector, you know, there is sort of more of a need for student support in general. Where that gap's coming from, you know, whether that's coming from upbringing, society, you know, general lack of you know, lack of what's the word, from, you know, if it's missing from the university in general, then I'm not sure where that's coming from. But yeah, there's definitely a need for student support, and to look after those students and sort of have them in our care. We do have around 80% of students who are from a widening participation or disability background, and that is more than the national average. So I guess in ways it does make us a little bit different. We certainly, as a university, and I've worked at other universities before, there's definitely a very community aspect. We are located out in a farm. You know, it's not necessarily that accessible. It's very beautiful, but I think because of those things, we are very much like a community, and we are a fairly small university as well, at 8,000 students, which is quite small, really, relatively speaking. So yeah, I think we are a little bit different, but I think those general principles apply across the university sector. You know, there is a need for it, for sure.
And what about the students themselves? Because, okay, I fully appreciate that you will have a slightly different profile of student, maybe, to other universities. So maybe if we could just be generalistic at the moment, what sort of difference are you seeing in students that you don't recognise in yourself as a student? And I think this is possibly leading to why there's a need for more support. But, you know, what's the difference in the students who are coming to your university today than maybe 5, 10, 15 years ago?
I think confidence and aspiration are two things I notice. You know, lack of confidence, you know, when I was younger, I just used to go for things and I wasn't really like too scared about it, but they seem to have those anxieties that a lot quicker age than we had them. There's more awareness, there's more, tales of failure, if you like. Definitely a lack of confidence for sure. But in terms of aspiration as well, I think many people feel, you know, you could go to university, but it might not help you get a good job. It's not necessarily going to give you the lifestyle you want or help you to buy a house. There's a lot of sort of negative things in the press about how you can't ever find a house, there's not enough houses, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough this. So I think that can affect people's ability to want to really just go for it. They may feel like anything they try is not actually going to help them sort of move along society, and whatever they may hope and dream, they may feel that there's just a general pessimism there.
A real interesting thing, because everyone always sees, they see Gen Z as being this very confident out there because of the way they present themselves. But underneath what I suspect is quite a thin veneer of confidence, actually they're not. And of course, social media has a huge part to play in this. And social media, of course, when you came to university was in a very different place.
For sure. I think that outward confidence is, like you said, it's a veneer. It's sort of channeling your identity and your confidence through your appearance, being able to be more, more sort of relaxed. Like I see students in all states of dress, they might be in pajamas, tracksuits, really smart, all sorts of things, and that's absolutely fine. But I think there's certain, like, identity is channeled through sort of external appearance, definitely. But when you scratch beneath the surface, I've been talking to students who I would say, just looking at them briefly, I'd be like, wow, they're not going to have any problems, they're going to do really well. But when I speak to them, they have incredibly low self-esteem. They feel they're not good enough, that everyone hates them, that they haven't got a chance, and you think, what? Yes, you do. But some of them really feel that. And then there are some as well who, for want of a better word, can be delusional, who want to find, a 30k job as soon as they finish university. They want a house, they want a car, they want this, because they've almost been saturated with culture about what it means to be successful and what it means to be good. So there's a lot going on in terms of external influences and expectations, but I think in general it's that feeling that not necessarily that they can actually do anything to change their outcome in life massively through participating in education, even though it is true.
And
it is true that people do.
And let's look at expectations for a moment, because obviously you have an incredibly important role preparing young people for the workplace. And there are many who will say that actually the young are coming into the workplace very ill prepared. They're not ready because, for a variety of different reasons. Is it the university's job to prepare them for the workplace? Is that society's? Is it parents? Where does that come from? And, what can be done to help reassure employers that actually our students are ready for work, they are prepared, and that you should hire them?
That's a tough question, Alastair. Yeah. I think, yes, it is our job, but it's not an easy job. I've dealt with a lot of students who are struggling at work, and some of the things they say are just things we all struggle with every day. They don't like 9 to 5. They don't like commuting. They want hybrid work. Someone said to me the other day, oh, my commute's 30 minutes door to door. It's just way too much. And I thought, oh, that's all right. But it's
Good luck
just
with that.
Yeah, it's just different expectations, isn't it? So I think there's a shift going on in what work should be and what you should actually get from it. So I guess the main job for us is preparing people to be flexible and go for it. But yeah.
And how do you bridge that? Because I can imagine if they've come in and wherever they've got these expectations from, which might not match certainly don't match in many cases the expectations of the workplace, how do you try and sort of bridge that gap, if you like?
Well, we, in our team, in placements team, like I said, we do have a lot of people with issues in their workplace, and I am always someone there for them to talk to, and I encourage them to reflect. I'm not going to say, oh, you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't think like this. No, because that's no good. I will say to them, why do you think your manager was annoyed? And then what do you think maybe they were going through? What sort of constraints may they have? How is this affecting you? And I think as long as you encourage people to be reflective, like they're always going to make mistakes. There's always going to be a few teething problems when you get your first professional level role. There certainly was for me. But I think encouraging people to sort of reflect and be honest with themselves about why something will go wrong. Obviously, sometimes it's never going to work, but many people, you will see a turnaround. I had a student who, a manager contacted me because they weren't asking enough questions or being engaged. And then when I spoke to the student, they said, oh, I didn't want to bother them, because they look busy, so it's like, it's just sort of, bridging those communication gaps, why people may be acting the way they are, and, encouraging them to sort of see another person's perspective as well and how that may look. So, yeah, we have a lot of follow-ups, and we will chat about just encouraging people to dig deeply about, perhaps how they behaved in the situation, and how to move forward professionally as well, because mistakes and upsets do happen, but it's how you deal with it, which is important. Are you going to learn from this, or are you going to figure out maybe this isn't for you?
And they, of course, are going to go into the workplace. The chances are they're going to be working for a millennial. That's the most likely. But also they'll be interacting with Gen X's and boomers. How do you, or is there anything that you do to prepare them for the fact that they will be dealing with other generations, and different generations have different viewpoints, have different perspectives? So how do you prepare them in that way?
Well, any student that goes on placement, we do a pre-placement briefing that, while it doesn't go into detail about those sort of issues, which has given me an idea actually, and I think maybe I will in my next session.
Maybe we should come and work together on that one.
Yeah, get you involved. They'd love that. But yeah, certainly we talk about sort of, the fact that you're going to be dealing with lots of different people. University's a bit of a bubble in a way. You're with lots of people the same age, same values, same views. People do tend to pick university based on certain characteristics. So you will get a lot of similar people there. So we try to, remind them, particularly people like my students. I do education and healthcare and science. So, those students are mixing with everyone. So it's about reminding them about, you are going to mix with other people, and just be really careful of your communication style and how, you work well with other people, and sort of maintaining professionalism. We do quite a lot about professionalism and sort of how to maintain that, and how and why it is important in the workplace, and how it's not just one day of being unprofessional, that actually that mindset can affect you going forward, for lots of different reasons. So we try to remind people of those things, and also just encourage them to talk to us. So, if you are having an issue at work and you feel that something's not right, or that you're not dealing with it right, speak to your coordinator, talk it through. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with people, and they've said to me at the end, oh, I feel better now. I get that now. Because sometimes in the work environment, things can really sort of magnify, it's actually not that much of a big deal outside of work, but when you're in that environment, it can seem like more. So just reminding people of those factors, particularly if you're working somewhere like healthcare or education, where things can get quite stressful. Yeah, just encouraging good communication, I guess.
And it's interesting because the younger generation generally have had their hand held quite a lot throughout their lives. That's just the nature of upbringing today. And of course, to help them prepare for the fact that their managers might not have the level of time that they would like, and might not be able to be as, as giving in terms of what they have available to the students. So almost preparing them for the fact that they might have to be a little bit more, work by themselves more and be more self-reliant, which obviously is a bit of a challenge. The last thing I want to talk about very briefly is a big topic which I think is particularly pertinent to Gen Z, because they, for Gen Z at university at the moment, or just entering the workplace, I know there's a big pressure that they feel that employers are going to expect them to be aware of AI and have a knowledge of AI. And the reality is that, up to date, we're all discovering it for ourselves. And therefore, the university lecturers are not going to probably know that much more than the students necessarily. 5 years' time, that will be a very different case. How are you navigating the AI world? First of all, in terms of what students or how students interact with it at the moment, but also then preparing them for the expectation of the workplace that they might be expected to be using AI tools.
So we encourage students to use AI responsibly. So it can be a great tool, in careers, not obviously in academia, it's a little bit different. And I wouldn't want to touch on that because that's not my area. But in terms of careers, you can use AI to give yourself a shell cover letter and then make it your own, because that does save time. Many other students will be using it anyway. We don't encourage people just to use it blanketly, just to make lots of generic things, but to encourage idea generation and sort of to interact with it in a positive way, to get a CV template rather than spending lots of time on the layout, when you just really want to think about the content and where you'd be using that. We certainly encourage them to use it that way. We have, chatbots that students can ask questions, quick questions, which, will encourage them to engage with the career service, at a time that suits them. And then they'd be able to, sort of get more of an idea of what we can offer. It's really difficult to prepare people for, a technology which is advancing. You could do a whole module on a certain type of AI, and like you said, next week no one uses it anymore. But what we do
But
encourage.
are you getting the employers when you do the placements? Are they asking you questions about AI?
But
Okay,
that's just
okay.
me personally. But they, I think what they're keen for and what we're keen for as well is just to produce graduates who are aware, aware of the need to constantly train, to be flexible and adaptable, in this ever changing world, not just in terms of AI, but in terms of work experience opportunities, culture, politics, whatever, if you can encourage people to embrace that change and to be resilient and to, not get too attached to anything. And that's what, we have certain grad attributes which we promote, being about ethical, adaptable, flexible, all of these sort of transferable skills which can be applied in a wide variety of settings. But yeah, I think it's really difficult to say, you must be interested in AI, you must be able to use this. It's more like you must be aware that this is a thing and it could help you, and you could need to use it at some point. I personally like AI. I think it's a good thing, but not everyone does, and I completely respect that, and I understand the reasons why. But I use it quite a lot in my day to day. It will make me a presentation quite quickly that I can adapt. That you would really stress me out before having to do a presentation and make the layout nice. Anything that can make my life a little bit easier, I'm super on board with. I'm just looking forward to getting AI that will do the housework.
Wouldn't that be great? It's been a fascinating insight into the world of university today, which I'm sure people will see as being very different to the one that they experienced. I'd like to finish off by really giving some helpful advice to maybe what are the top things you advise your students as Gen Zs coming into the workplace, dealing with older people, but also what advice would you give to older generations to embrace Gen Z coming into the workplace?
My advice would be the same for both, and the same that I say to students all the time. Don't take anything personally. Most of the time, it's, if people offend you, it's a mistake or a miscommunication or a generational difference, a cultural difference. You have to remember all the different things that older people and younger people have had to deal with growing up and how that shaped them. And I think it's important for everyone just to see the full picture and just to not take, and the same with the job market as well, do not take anything personally. You just have to keep on going and try not to get hung up on failures or rejections, because it's quite a normal part of everyday life. At basketball, like I said, we do have that support, and sometimes it does our students no favors, because it's not going to be like that in the real world. However, I think as long as we just encourage people to, be nice, appreciate that everyone is different, everyone's got their own struggles going on, and whether you're 65 or 25, you will still find common ground somehow, for sure. It's just about opening those channels and respecting other people, really. I know that can be difficult, but that's
And
what
you know what's really, what I love is, again, putting on the stereotypical hat for a second, that's a very millennial approach. That collaborative team spirit. Let's just work together, everybody, kind of thing, which is great. So I think you're in absolutely the right role.
Yeah.
Charlotte, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you for being on the podcast and giving us that really fascinating perspective of student life today.
Oh, thank you, Alastair. It's been really nice to chat and to remind myself what I do.
Yeah, well, it's outstanding, the work all universities do. It's a challenging environment, so we take our hats off to you for all you do. So thank you again for being on the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks' time for another Generationally Speaking podcast. Bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.